Welcome to this session of the Center for the Economics of the Internet here at the Hudson. The mic is on. Hello. Welcome to this session of the Center for the Economics of the Internet here at the Hudson Institute. We're very honored today to have with us Professor Jerry Hausman of MIT. Does this microphone work better? They're both on. I'll just have to speak louder, which is always a challenge. A couple of housekeeping matters. I want to tell you about a couple of upcoming events. One on December 4th on retransmission consent. My colleague, Commissioner Robert McDowell, has organized a star-studded panel to discuss retransmission consent and the great policy debate over that. On December 16th, to mark the centennial anniversary of the Kingsbury Accord, we're going to have a program on the mythology of Kingsbury. We're very pleased to have Bob Crandall of the Brookings Institute and John Thorne of Kellogg. Huber will come speak about what does it mean, the anniversary, the centennial anniversary of Kingsbury. But today, we're very pleased to have Professor Jerry Hausman of MIT. Jerry is the McDonald Professor of Economics at MIT, and I'm going to tell a few stories about Professor Hausman, so close your ears, Jerry. I came to MIT in 1974 as an undergraduate, and I started working on a project with a couple of graduate students. And the MIT Economics Department at the time and today is a place of vigorous competitive intellectual thought, lots of very bright people, and filled with Nobel laureates and future Nobel laureates. And I remember these two graduate students telling me, the person to watch is Jerry Hausman. He's the bright person in this department, which I thought was no small compliment. Over the years, I had the pleasure of taking a couple of courses from Jerry. I won't say I did particularly well, but I learned a lot, and I've read as much of his writing as I could over the years. He's very prolific, and so it's hard to keep track of everything he's written. But I think the consistent theme of Jerry's writing is to apply economic thought and reasoning to economic information to make inferences that are really quite profound and elegant in their simplicity, to learn about everything from what the real discount rate that consumers have to properly measuring taxes, to properly measuring changes in utility or welfare over time. So today we're in for a real treat because Professor Hausman is going to tell us about the use of mobile devices and LDCs, and I'm sure it's going to be filled with his usual combination of economic understanding applied to economic data and a great deal of wit as well. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Hausman.
Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to be here. So this paper has a number of topics, but I picked one out that I thought people would like. This is a revision of an earlier paper that I gave at a Berkeley conference a few years ago. But I just finished the revision yesterday, so as soon as my co-author, Professor Zhang, who's at University in Chengdu, China, he had visited MIT last year. As soon as he fixes my English, I'll post a paper on my website. So it should be up by the beginning of next week, so you can just pull it off my MIT website. So one of the themes of this paper, and I should say I'm not a development economist and proud of it, is looking at the welfare that people have gotten from cell phones or mobile devices in a number of countries. And then a secondary objective is looking at how you might want to measure welfare based on that. So a subtitle of this paper is "You're not as poor as you think, or the World Bank thinks you are, if you have cell phones." Okay, so with that, I'll get going. So if we look at what's happened over the last few years, all the data that I use in this is as of this summer, the latest data you can get. It sort of depends on the country. But in India, mobile penetration reached 72.3 per 100 inhabitants in 2009, which is pretty much a 50% growth rate over the period. So you might remember 5 years ago or so, they were talking about the mobile lady in these villages, in which one person would have a mobile phone, which I'll probably call a cell phone half the time when I'm not thinking about it, and then the whole village would do it because they don't have any wireline phone service because the Indian government, in its usual corrupt way, has controlled wireline. So there's next to no wireline service in India, certainly in these in the rural areas. But that has changed now, and when you go into Indian villages, a lot of people have cell phones. So 72.3 per 100 is that's pretty good, if you want to look at things that way. That's probably above where the U.S. was in about 2002, 2004. Handset costs are about $25. India has tremendous competition. They have about 7 mobile providers pretty much throughout the country. So phone calls are about a penny a minute. And the average monthly expenditure on mobile phones is $2.45, which is about 4.5% of income. So that's a pretty significant amount of money to spend. So one thing you might want to take from that is that people find mobile phones to be quite worthwhile if they're spending that amount of their income when they don't have a lot of income to spend. Okay, and then the Hicksian compensating variation, this is a consumer surplus, is about $4.56 percent per month, and I say that's 4.4% of income, and those two numbers don't match up, so I clearly have a typo, which is correct in the paper. Okay, but if you look at graphs, you can see what happened is China and India. For whatever reason, economists are fascinated by contrast between China and India. You can see that China was much higher, but essentially in the last few years, and now up to 2011, India has pretty much caught up to China in terms of penetration. Okay, so one of the things the paper does, and I can't get them all on slides because I just don't know how to do it, but I look at a bunch of countries and I look at mobile penetration per 100 inhabitants. So there's quite a bit of variation. You take a country like Algeria, the common theme is they've gone, from very low penetration. 2003 was 4.5, and they're up to pretty close to 100 now. And you take a country, a very poor country like Bangladesh, whose income per capita in U.S. dollars, and I'll get back to that, is only a tenth of Algeria. You can see what's happened there. It's gone from less than 1 in 2003, and now it's up to 56 in 2011. And a lot of variation across countries, Bolivia and so on. So it does turn out that there's income is pretty important in terms of penetration. I'll get back to that later. The other thing to notice is, apart from Belarus and some of the former Russian republics, or communist countries like Bosnia, and I won't even try to pronounce it, they have pretty low fixed line. And it turns out that fixed line penetration in most of these countries has actually been decreasing over the last 5 to 10 years. So people don't find fixed line to be very important. My observation for the U.S. is, in a sense, the thing that kept fixed line going, or has kept fixed line going to now, has basically been the internet. So in other words, I think we're up to about 30% of households in the U.S. don't have fixed line anymore. They just have mobile phones. It's especially young people. Very few, less than half, have fixed line. But for internet, for instance, AT&T, they have UVerse, and then Verizon has Fios and all, and they compete against the cable companies. And you have very high internet penetration, and that essentially uses fixed line, either cable or combination cable and copper. And it's not clear what's going to happen within a few years. I mean, 4G people for mobile say within 2 or 3 years, you'll be able to get 20 meg on your cell phone, which is more than enough to do what almost anybody wants to do, unless you're sending x-rays over the internet. But it's certainly more than fast enough for TV downloading and all. There is this question of capacity and on what the FCC will do in terms of spectrum. But fixed line is still going, in the Western countries, developed countries. But as I say, it's not clear how long that's going to continue. Okay, so one of the things we do in the paper is we take 27 developing countries and we do an econometric study and estimate the price and income elasticity. And this is done a number of ways. So it's done, we do it 2 different ways. One is we use data from India for 2008, and then the other is we use 27 developing countries. And what you see is that the price elasticity in India is higher than it is overall in the other countries. We estimate this very precisely, these T statistics. And the other thing is you get a quite large income elasticity. So to contrast these, the U.S. I know very well since I did the first study on price and income elasticities in the U.S. This is back in the middle 90s. But it actually hasn't changed much, at least according to what people send me to read. The U.S., the price elasticity has typically been around a half. That's very much similar to that in Australia, UK. I don't know. I often worry about this because when people send me papers, it may be just because they have estimated similar elasticities to what I did to the U.S. But actually, every once in a while, I look at what's on the internet in terms of research, and it's usually around there. And the other thing is that the income elasticity in the U.S. is very low. Income has a very minor role in terms of mobile phone adoption and usage. But you can see, as you would probably expect, in these LDCs, that income has a much larger role. But you can see that the income elasticity in India is a good deal higher than in the sample of developing countries. Okay, so this is a mathematical formula. This is from a 1981 paper of mine. This basically allows you to estimate the compensating variation, which is the right way to do consumer surplus. And the idea is that this is the amount of money people would be willing to pay above and beyond what they actually pay to have the good. Okay? And I go and do this for a sample of states in India. One of the reasons I do this for India, as fallout of the British Raj, India has very good statistics. So if you want to study things like this on a state level in India, you can actually get the data. You'll see how I use that shortly. But so I have this one Indian state, Matali Das, my student sitting here, who probably could pronounce it better than me, but I will call it Karuthi. Good. And what you can see is that the monthly mobile expenditure, it's about 4.8%. And these are the right numbers. And you can see that the compensating variation is about the same. So what this says is that people would be willing to pay approximately double what they pay to have mobile phone service in this Indian state. If you look on the panel estimate on the right, you'll see that it's a higher number. It's $10 a month. And the reason for that is that the slope of the demand curve is not as steep. Okay, but another way that I do this, this depends on using the functional form, is in my Brookings paper from the middle 90s, I discuss about how to calculate a lower bound. This is basically a linear tangent to the indifference curve, and you see that the numbers go down to $1.35 and $1.87, but it's still, compared to what they're spending, a significant amount of money. So from this, and I'll do it for a bunch of countries, you'll see that mobile and the spread of mobile in these countries has brought a lot of welfare to people. Okay, so these are a number of states in India, and you can see that the income varies quite a bit. Bihar is very poor. It's 14,000, and then Delhi, where the rich bureaucrats live, is 67,000, and I'm trying to remember which of these is Mumbai. Maybe it's not up here. Which state Mumbai is? Yeah, it's not here, right? Yeah, it's in the paper, but for some reason it didn't make it here. And then you can see the penetration in Delhi. You have 111. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with mobile, you might say, how can it be greater than 100%? In fact, how can it even be close to 100%? Do dogs have mobile in Delhi? And the answer is no. It's a combination of two things. One is when people shift carriers, oftentimes the old carriers actually don't update their thing. But the more important thing is, in most of the rest of the world, apart from the U.S., they have what are called SIM cards. So you have your mobile phone, and there's this little card, and each carrier has its own SIM card. So what people do is they subscribe to more than one mobile carrier, because if you do pay by the call, rather than contracts like we typically have here, there's no monthly fee. So you can get a SIM card, I don't know, it costs maybe $5. And then you can use that SIM card, you load it with a certain number of minutes, and you use that SIM card depending on the time of day or the day of the week where it's cheapest. So, people actually pay a lot of attention because they're paying for every call. And it's not only true in places like India, but in Italy and, a lot of places like that, you see it as well. Okay, and then what you see is a CV in these various places, taking into account the penetration and all. And it's pretty much, between 4% in Delhi up to 9%. So, a lot of consumer surplus. Okay, so then what I do this across a bunch of countries. And what I do is I use China rather than the United States as my basis. So that's not to say that I expect China to take over anytime soon, but in terms of countries, it seems to me to be better or more illuminating to compare things to China. But anyway, so note, as that graph showed before, China and India. India's basically caught up to China, 73.2 and 72. And you can see that GNI, which is gross national income, in nominal U.S. dollars is 3 times higher in China. So, for any economists in the crowd, you'll remember that 20 years ago, India actually had higher GDP per capita than China, but China has far surpassed India. A personal story is I first went to China in 1989 and was in Beijing and then went to Shanghai. And in Beijing, the good news was there were no cars on the road apart from army vehicles and a few taxis, so there were no traffic jams. The bad news was you couldn't find a decent restaurant. So it was only when I went to Hong Kong on my way back, that I felt that I was getting decent Chinese food as a Chinese food fan. And then the other thing was I went to Shanghai, and the head of the Bank of China, who is an MIT graduate, showed me along the Bund in Shanghai. And for those of you who've been there, you look across and Pudong is there now. Pudong in those days was a cow field. So you could see some cows, and all the buildings on the Bund were just completely, in a shambles. And the Army used it, I think, for artillery practice, I was told. I wasn't, allowed to go out there. Anyway, so I didn't go back to China until 2002, which was approximately 14 years later, and I got off a plane in Beijing, and even then the traffic jams, and all were amazing. And I said, boy, this is really something. Then I said to myself, well, in 14 years at 10% growth a year, that means, since if you teach at MIT, you have to be able to do this in your head. That means with compound interest, the economy is quadrupled. It's a rule of 70. 10 into 70 is 7 years. That's just a lesson in logs for anybody who's interested. Probably nobody is except me. But anyway, the economy had quadrupled. So, you say to yourself, there really is something about growth that would do wonders. So I don't want to get into politics, which I detest in the United States, but it's something that people might want to remember. Growth solves a lot of problems in life. So when we look at these other countries, again, we see that the prices vary quite a bit. So in India, you can see that the average revenue per month is $2.45. You saw that number before. And in China, it's about 4 times as high. So if we look at the consumer surplus, there's quite a difference. But the consumer surplus divided by GNI is sort of interesting. China's a little bit above India, but not a lot. And most of the countries are, in the same ballpark. I mean, there are some differences. Botswana, which is a very rich country because of diamonds, and I guess I don't know much about this, but I guess they have a government that doesn't steal it all. So they're at 8,532. So their consumer surplus per GNI is lower. Cambodia is higher, but most of them are between approximately 5 and 10%. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the title of the talk. So what I want to do is I want to say, well, we know what the gross national income is, and we can measure it in U.S. dollars. But what the international agencies, such as the World Bank and development economists, they want to do this in a different way. And so what they have typically done is to deflate income by a price index relative to the U.S. And do purchasing power parity comparisons. Okay, so my view is purchasing power parity comparisons are crap, and it keeps a lot of people at the international agencies, I guess, in business. But I'm going to explain to you why that's so. But I should say, in the larger scheme of things, I think the U.S. statistics the CPI is also crap. I've said that numerous times in print, and I've told my wife also that if I'm found dead in an alley someday, it won't be Whitey Bulger and the Winter Hill Gang in Boston. For those of you who went to school, Whitey just got 2 life sentences. It won't be Whitey and the gang, because I stay away from those people, but it'll be somebody from the BLS who I've... So I ran into Catherine Abraham once, who's my former colleague and was head of the BLS at the time. We had both been at a conference in Canada, Statistics Canada, which I should say is much better than the U.S. BLS. But anyway, I said, what's the problem? Do you people just have a bias? You want to keep inflation high, so people get more Social Security? Because, I'm not against giving people more money, but I don't think you should do it by doctoring CPI. But we didn't see eye to eye on that. Okay, but I have papers on that if you want to see them on my website. But anyway, PPP is much worse than the CPI. Okay, so what do they do for PPP? Well, what you do is you compare all goods that are bought in both countries, and you look at the expenditure shares, and you basically take a harmonic mean, and then you compare the prices in the 2 countries and add up. Okay? However, there's this problem that, for instance, breakfast cereals are popular in many English-speaking countries, but are not consumed in French-speaking countries. So you might say, well, how do they do this? You're in French West Africa, and you want to find the price of Rice Krispies. Well, the only way you find the price of Rice Krispies is the expatriates who are willing to pay a lot of money for Rice Krispies, because I guess they need their Rice Krispies fix in the morning, or whatever you're used to eating. So I'm not the first person to say this. Angus Deaton had some papers on this a few years ago. But anyway, it's what bureaucracies love to do. They gather hundreds or thousands of prices of individual items, and they have all sorts of index number problems. And so it keeps a lot of people busy, but they get the wrong answer. So this is like the BLS in the United States, who after all these years still sends price checkers out to stores. So you can, I mean, if you know them, you can see them. They'll send somebody out to a Best Buy to copy down the price of TVs. Okay, so I've said for years, you could use Nielsen or IRI data, the cash register data, but of course you couldn't employ nearly so many people if you did that. And that's the logic of government bureaucracies. Well, it's not only that people would lose their job, but you, their supervisor, instead of being a GS-17, if they still have those numbers, this is back to my days when I was in the Corps of Engineers for 2 years. You can figure out why in the late 1960s. But anyway, instead of being a GS-17, you'd only be a GS-15 because you'd have 2 people working for you rather than 200. Okay, so they end up with the wrong answer. They have this further problem that they don't take into account new goods, and I've written numerous papers about this. And in fact, mobile telephones are one that they actually don't take into account correctly. So what I say is there's no economics involved in construction of PPP indices. It's accounting, not economics. And that is also true, of course, for the BLS. That's one of my 2 big complaints. Okay, so the rapid spread of mobile has led to convergence in consumption across countries. But to quote a phrase from my colleague Bob Solo, who I hope Harold took a course from when he was at MIT, you can't find it in the real income comparisons, even though individuals spend about 5% of their income on mobile. Okay, so this is my new approach. Now, I think a lot of people think this is crazy, and maybe it is, but it's interesting. So that's the best thing about academic work. You can do crazy but interesting things. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use revealed consumer behavior. Okay, so this is the idea. When you take microeconomics, which I'm sure Harold took from me, 1404, we say that people get utility from their consumption. So I mean that's, you don't have to call it utility, but that's the basis of economics. Okay, so we don't compare prices and say you're better or worse off looking at prices. That's just a means to an end. You have a certain amount of income, something has a price, and then you decide how much you want to buy of it. So I'm going to use revealed consumer behavior here. And my approach, or our approach, differs from PPP construction, which are accounting exercises which take share-weighted averages of prices. But they don't incorporate economic behavior, unless you want to argue that that comes into the expenditure shares. And instead, we use observed economic demand for mobile phones to determine how to adjust income to put it on a comparable basis. Okay, so here's what I think is interesting about this. I'm not saying that you should only use mobile phones, but mobile phones are something that I happen to be interested in, and it's straightforward to get the data because it's collected. But if you really wanted to compare well-being across countries, I would think you would want to see whether people have mobile phones, whether they have refrigerators, whether they have bicycles, and what their caloric intake is, and all sorts of things like that. So a lot of this stuff you can actually get, some of it you can get in surveys. I mean, food is watched very closely. But if you put together a basket of these, we could then do demand estimation and compare utility across countries. So I think that is really the way to go. And what I'm saying is I'm just looking at one thing, which are mobile phones, and which do have certain advantages. The technology is the same across the world. So, if somebody has 3G, it's going to be just as good in India as it is as 3G was in the United States. They don't have 4G yet, of course. They will soon, and it's pretty much used for the same stuff. However, I am going to make the usual heroic assumption of a representative individual with common tastes across countries, which for mobile phones I think might not be too bad. But if you start thinking about refrigerators, could differ a lot, depending on the climate of the country. Now, this could be done on individual data from survey data, which people like the World Bank does do. So, if somebody a graduate student wanted to put a lot of time and effort in, could get that type of data and look at it. We've used that to some extent, you'll see later. Okay, so this is a demand equation that I've used. So it says the quantity, this is just the Cobb-Douglas that all of you remember from your economics. So the quantity of mobile phone, and we do either penetration of mobile phones or the number of minutes per month, you get pretty much the same answer, is equal to a constant. And then you have price to the alpha, and then you have income to the delta. But the one thing, if I can get this to work, is here I have the price deflator pi. Okay? So that's actually what PPP or any of these things are trying to do, is they're trying to figure out what the deflator should be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this equation. We know Q, we know P, we know Y. I'm going to solve for pi that solves this equation for you. So in other words, I'm just going to invert this equation and say, what does a deflator have to be in a given country? So I'm taking the expectation of this equation that was estimated a number of slides ago. I take the expectation of this equation, and then I say, what should the price deflator be such that I satisfy Q given P and Y in this equation? Okay? So that's a pretty straightforward idea. So PI is the price of mobile, and Y divided by pi is deflated income, where pi is the unobserved price index. So I solve for pi, which yields observed mobile penetration given the observed P and Y. And then Y divided by pi I becomes a measure of real income based on mobile penetration and the estimated demand curve. So, if you did this across a number of goods, you could think about estimating 4 or 5 equations, and one would be for mobile phones, one would be for bicycles or cars, one would be for refrigerators, one would be for TVs and all, and you just solve for a common pi for each country. And if I had this over a number of goods, it would be over-identified, and then I could also test whether the pi's that I got for each equation were pretty similar for a given country. So you would see whether this whole setup worked. Okay, so I'm back to the Indian states now. So remember, Delhi is rich, the richest, and it has high mobile penetration. So I do this relative to the state, which somebody mentioned before, which is where Mumbai is. So that Mumbai, that's set equal to 1, that state. And then you can see that the income index for Delhi is about 55% higher. I guess I actually do this with respect to Delhi. I take it back. I changed this at some point. So its real income index is not going to change. But then I look at the Punjab, which you can see is a good deal less rich than Delhi. Its income index starts off at 102. No, I do this relative to Mumbai. It has to be. And then the real income index actually goes up to 108. Kerala, which is a communist-run state, which supposedly has the highest literacy rate in China, you can see it starts off at 41, and its income index goes up by about 15%, from 0.9 to 1.04. But these are sort of the most interesting. UP, which starts off at 0.39, goes up to 0.75. So what's going on here is that these places, which in terms of measurement are quite poor, and remember that it's all the same currency, it's rupees, so I don't have to worry about that. When I adjust for the cellular penetration, you can see that these poor places go up quite a bit. I mean, they're still poorer than Delhi and Mumbai and all, but they don't look nearly so poor as they might otherwise look. And to some extent this may be, but again, I want to emphasize I'm not a development economist. This may be because there's a lot of agriculture in these various states, and so the measured income could be a lot less, because of people consuming their food, and also, of course, not paying taxes, not declaring income. Okay, so what happens is the mean index increases from 0.75 to 0.92. So at the extreme, the unadjusted income has Bihar at 0.32 times Maharashtra, that's the state where Mumbai is, but adjusted real income goes up to 0.64. So overall, 12 states converge toward the mean, while 5 states diverge away from, I should say the mean from 1.0. The mean is actually 0.92, as I say up here. But the interesting thing is the variance of real income decreases significantly relative to the variance of measured income. So the variance of the unadjusted income index is 0.09, while the variance of the real income adjusted index is 0.04. So, if you want to say, well, what's the real income? Albeit this is based only on mobile, so you want to take it with a huge grain of salt. But you can see that this comes down by quite a bit. So thus, measured inequality among Indian states decreases significantly when I make a real income adjustment. Okay, so now we're going to do this for all these countries. And I am only going to show you, some of them. The rest are in the paper. But you start off with China, and you might say, well, we saw this. It's about 3-to-1 in terms of dollars. And so this means that India is really going to go up a lot. But when you start off, and as I said, I do this all relative to China, India starts off at 0.35, but India only goes up to 0.38. So you might say, well, I don't quite get this because the mobile penetration is the same, and if the mobile's penetration is the same, doesn't that mean they're just about as well off? Okay? And the answer to that is no. Sorry. The answer to that is no, because although the income is 3 times as high, the prices in China are about 4 times as high. So what's happening is a lot of people who are getting mobile in India are doing so because they're paying quite a low price. And relative to their income, you can see that there's not a big difference. And so India does go up a little bit compared to China, but not much. Now, you don't just take these ratios and adjust it that way. You take the demand equation, and its estimated parameters, but that's the essential idea. Okay, and then someplace like Algeria, which has a very high penetration, its income is not a lot different from China. It actually comes down somewhat because, again, its mobile price compared to China is about 25% lower. Okay, so now let's take a country like Bangladesh, which is very poor, and their penetration is 56. So their price is actually a little bit less than India, not a lot less, but you can see that compared to India, their income per capita is about only 1/3 as high, and about 1/7 or 1/8 as high as India. But they come up from 0.13 to 0.26 because of their penetration. So, they come up quite a bit compared to India because they had a very low income. And when you solve out that equation, you take account of the income effect, and that's what happens. Okay, and then just looking at these, you can see that Bolivia also comes up quite a bit from 0.37 to 0.86, but someplace like Botswana, which is twice as rich as China in terms of income, actually comes down quite a bit, even though it has a very high penetration. Cambodia is another notable country. Starts off quite poor. It's 690, so apart from Bangladesh, it's the poorest in the sample. It has pretty expensive mobile. It's 0.59, but given that its penetration is not too far from 100, it actually goes up from 0.19 to 0.84. Okay, so overall, the mean index increases from 0.7 to 0.86, which is the expected direction of change since the sample contains a number of quite poor countries. But anyway, this is what I find most interesting. The variance of the index decreases from 0.35 to 0.21, which demonstrates a significant decrease in inequality once the measure is based on actual consumption. So this is what happened in India as well, although India, the variance started off a lot less. But here again, it falls. Now, if you compare this to the PPP adjustment using World Bank data, where the mean of the index decreases from 0.75 to 0.77 to 0.75. So when you do the PPP over the same countries, the mean basically stays the same. But the variance decreases by only a very small amount from 0.387 to 0.321. So I don't know whether people have ever done this before. Again, just to bore you, I'm not a development economist. But you would think that something like PPP should decrease the variance a lot because it's adjusting for expenditure. But depending on the sample countries you use, sometimes it barely goes down at all. So I thought my development economics colleagues at MIT would really be interested in this, but they sort of do experiments with mosquito nets. So they're not, they're not into this old style development economics. I mean, I'm not criticizing them because, figuring out whether people use mosquito nets is certainly important. But it seems to me there's something just wrong with PPP when the mean barely budges and the variance doesn't come down very much, because the idea of PPP is that the prices will differ. And in poorer countries, you get much more for your dollar, and the reason for that is labor costs are much less. And so the non-traded component of goods that go into PPP should be a lot cheaper in those countries. Not the traded good, but it's the non-traded good. And so therefore, you should be relatively better off in a poor country, at least the way I think about it. So therefore, mobile telephone usage demonstrates a much greater degree of real income convergence and a much lower degree of cross-country inequality than the PPP data. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at productive efficiency. So there's a famous paper by Jensen, 2007, and he looked at Kerala, which is a southern state in India. I've never been there, but I'm told it's incredibly beautiful. A lot of fishermen probably, because it's right on the coast there. And he reported that 60% of fishing boats and most wholesale and retail traders use mobile phones to determine which ports a fisherman should land their catch. I'm sorry about the typing. I'm not a very good typist. So anyway, the idea was these people were offshore, and they want to decide where they should bring their boat back, or their fish back, their boat. And they would call in and find out what the prices were, and then, just go to the place with the highest price. And that's going to increase economic efficiency, allocative efficiency, and of course is productive efficiency gains in terms of wasted fish and gasoline and all. So he found that the increase in fishermen's profits by 8%, decrease in consumer price by 4%, an overall increase in consumer surplus of about 0.06% of average household expenditure. Okay, so it's a well-known paper, and shows how mobile phones can be very useful. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn to another gain in productive efficiency and show that this dwarfs what he found in India. Okay? So I'm going to talk about mobile money. And in particular, as my example, I'll use M-Pesa. So what mobile money or M-Pesa does, this has been looked at a lot in the last few years, is you can have a 2G cell phone. So that's back in the days before you could get the internet on your cell phone. It's basically you just using a text message. And so in countries like Kenya, a lot of people go and work in the cities, and then they want to send money back home. Okay, well, there aren't many ATMs in Kenya. I've never been there, but outside the cities, there are very few ATMs. You can use the Kenyan post office, which I've been told is actually relatively honest, but it costs 3 times as much to transfer money that way as by M-Pesa. And you can use Western Union. And this is one of the few places I've ever come across where Western Union is not the most expensive way to send money. It's cheaper than the Kenyan post office, but it's still twice as expensive as M-Pesa. So the way that M-Pesa works is you have all these agents. I hope I don't hurt anyone's feelings, but I presume that a great percentage of them are Indians who went to Kenya when the British were running the place, or the merchant class in Kenya, I've been told. And so there are now about 50,000 agents, and they're in all these little villages and all. And what they do is somebody sends you an M-Pesa message, you go in and show it to the agent, and he forks over the money, or she forks over the money. And the average amount sent is about $30. And you can either send or receive money. People also use M-Pesa to top up their mobile phones. Remember, you pay by the call, so people, will buy the equivalent of $1 or $2 or $5 worth of calls, and they also do that. But the other thing you can do is you can pay your utility bills. So if you do have something like electricity, I mean, it's really amazing. I've seen this in India. You can waste a whole day going to stand in line to pay your electric bill in India. Hey, who cares? So it's just an enormous drag on the economy. So in Kenya, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, Vodafone has now started it in India. You can pay your utility bills this as well, so you don't have to go stand in line, which is a good thing. So in 2008, Kenya had a mobile penetration of 42, and which was 77% of the population. So in 2007, Safaricom, which is now run by Vodafone, or owned by Vodafone, about 50% of it, the largest mobile phone in Kenya, introduced M-Pesa. So as I said, it allows individuals to transfer money to other individuals as well as deposit and withdraw funds using their mobile phones. So, this is one of the coincidences or lucky events in regulatory history. In Kenya, there was this big argument about should M-Pesa be regulated like a bank. So that would have been the death knell. But of course, that's what the banks wanted because they didn't want the competition. But for whatever reason, the Kenyan government decided not to regulate them as banks, while the Indian government has decided to regulate them as banks. I'll get back to India shortly. And so it really took off. So Jack and Suri found that 38% of the population was using it. It was about 45% in 2010. And Vodafone sent me the most recent data from July 2013, and now it's up to about 70%. So if you get a copy of the paper, you'll see it's very highly used. So when I wrote the previous copy of the paper, it had 15,000 agents. Now it has 52,000 agents. So, it's just everywhere. So volume in 2010 was significantly less than the traditional banking system. Now it's 4 times as high. There were 870 transactions. Now there are 2 million transactions. So it just shows it's been growing at 40 or 50% of the year. And the overall value per day of mobile was 80% as large as ATMs. Now it's 300%. So these are all updated in the paper. I should have perhaps done the slides, but I didn't get around to it. And as I said, sending money via M-Pesa is significantly less expensive than sending money via the post office or Western Union. So post office is about 3 times the price of M-Pesa. It also takes, a couple days to get there. Western Union does get there right away. It's twice as expensive. But, of course, M-Pesa gets there immediately because it's just a cell phone call. Okay, so we have survey data, and we find out that in the survey, which was done in 2011, 71% of the sample in Kenya send money while 66 receive money. Okay, so by now, mobile money have been launched in over 125 countries. Economic potential is significant, as in many of the world, no banks or ATMs are present. But mobile phone networks are often available. And in many of these places, this is interesting, these places don't even have electricity, but they have mobile phones because they put up solar towers. And it tends to work. Okay, so there's this outfit in London that follows this, that gets money from the Gates Foundation, which is referred to in the paper. I think it's called GSM, but I'm not sure. And they put out a study every year. And then the World Bank and the IMF has also looked at this to some extent, more of the World Bank. And what you see is that there are about 2.5 billion are unbanked, but approximately 50% of these individuals have mobile phones. So in Kenya, it's estimated, that only about 25% of the people have bank accounts, but we know that a very large percentage have mobile phones. However, the spread of mobile money has been very uneven. The networks are often opposed by banks and regulators in a number of countries. I say India, as expected, you'd be disappointed otherwise, have retarded the use of mobile money networks, even though, there's large utility. However, I have hopes for India because they have a new head of the central bank, He just started last month, and he's an MIT graduate. So next time I see him, I'm going to tell him that they should remove the regulation in India and get them going. Okay, so here's some countries in Southern Africa that I just used to compare. And so you can see, Kenya in 2011 was 67, and then you can see what their income is. And these are the number from a survey that people are sending at 66 and 71. You can see that it varies quite a bit across countries. In South Africa, which is, the richest by far of these countries, it's really pretty low. But I think the reason for that is that they have a pretty well-developed banking system. So it's less useful in South Africa, although, they certainly have it. And you can see that Gabon and Kenya by far have the most usage. And Tanzania, which Vodafone also runs, the statistics in the paper, and I remember right off, it's taken off in the last couple of years since Vodafone took over, but not as high, not close to as high as Kenya. Okay, so now I'm going to do some real econometrics. I actually did before for the demand stuff, but didn't want to disappoint anybody. So what we're going to do is we're going to estimate the first demand model estimated for mobile money, and we use micro individual survey from the World Bank, so they're good for that during survey data. So this is on individuals. The difficult thing was to get price data, and we could only get price data for 4 countries. I mean, the samples are still going to be in the thousands, but Kenya, Nigeria, Tanzania, and Uganda. And so we have about 4,000 observations, and whether or not they use mobile money, and we have various socio-demographics on them. And so, again, you'd have to look at the paper. I can't go through the details. But we use a bivariate probit model. So one part of the probit model is for sending, and the other is for receiving. And then we use what's called a control variable approach for prices. So this takes account of the endogeneity of price. And not surprisingly, we find a very high correlation between sending and receiving. The row is 0.905. So this says that, people that use it for sending also use it for receiving, which is pretty much what you'd expect. Okay, and then these are the some of the coefficients, and what you see is that things are very price sensitive, and we get huge. These are robust T statistics, but they're really very large. This is the income of the country, so you can see that also matters. Of course, income comes into whether or not they have a mobile phone. We know that's important. Less used by females, that's to be expected because it's typically the males who migrate to the cities. Age doesn't have much of an effect. It's interesting that education has somewhat of an effect, but less than I would have thought. And then we're looking at various levels of income, and you can see that it increases with income. Okay, and then in terms of receiving, things are again pretty price sensitive, and the coefficients are quite similar, although of course not the same as they are for sending. Okay, so then what we do is we estimate the compensating variation, the consumer surplus for this. So for Kenya, what we do is it's 18. This is, receiving is 19. So the total CV is 37. You can add these together because of integrability. This is their GNI. This is all done in US dollars. We don't have to, we're not doing PPP or anything like that or any type of adjustment. So you find out that the ratio is 4.6. So in other words, the ratio of consumer surplus to income for having a mobile phone in Kenya, if I remember right, is around 4.5%. And then the ratio for mobile money is another 4.6%. So you get up to almost 10% for having this. Nigeria, it's much less. You can see at Tanzania, it's about 1.1%. In Uganda, it's 2%. And you can see that even though the penetration is not that different, the percent of adults using mobile money differs by quite a bit. And this, again, is in part due to how well the banking system is developed, but it's also regulation. So in Nigeria, it's regulated as banks, and it's all it takes. As soon as it's regulated as banks, all these agents, out in the country, in the rural areas, are bank branches, and then you have all sorts of rules. Okay, so it's a way to make people worse off. Okay, so the conclusions are, there was a study done a few years ago at the Wharton School, and they surveyed all sorts of people, and they said, well, what new products have had the biggest effect in the past 30 years? And it was the internet, PCs, and mobile phones. But mobile phones have by far the largest penetration in developing countries. The mobile phones have provided widespread networks for voice telecommunications, where largely government-operated fixed-line networks fail to achieve widespread penetration. And competition among mobile providers has led to a far superior outcome than monopoly-operated fixed-line networks in most countries. So it's very rare for any of these countries to have fixed-line competition. If the government runs it, or government monopoly, usually partly owned by the government, runs it. But you take India, where you have 7 companies competing. You have very low prices, and you see this in a lot of LDCs. But I think here's one of the more interesting things to think about. As 3G and 4G become widespread in these countries, and again, some of the countries are rather slow. India is, because the government bureaucracy is trying to see how much money they can get in payments from the companies, both over the table and under the table. It's gone up to the Supreme Court in India. I mean, they have a real corruption problem. In China, 4G hasn't come in yet because they're trying to protect the homegrown technology against Qualcomm. They have their own technology, and they forced China Mobile, the largest company, to use it for 3G. So they've been rather slow, but I think 4G will come into China beginning of next year. Anyway, these countries have very low internet penetration by and large in LDCs. You don't have a lot of computers, and the fixed line is pretty abysmal. But in my view, what's going to happen is you're going to have individual access to the internet is going to come through smartphones and tablets. Okay? So the idea is, and smartphones and tablets are sort of converging as well. I mean, Samsung has a smartphone with a larger screen, and some other companies do as well. But anyway, what's going to happen is, this is how it's going to happen. So you have these very low-priced netbooks, which can be connected to the internet, and they can be connected either using mobile or fixed-line network. However, in my view, netbooks and ultrabooks may be made obsolete by smartphones. So smartphones are computers, add a keyboard and a monitor, or with a tablet, just a keyboard, and you're ready to go. So smartphones now in LDCs cost less than $50 to make. There's actually an article on Reuters today about how Qualcomm gets a lower margin in these countries, like in places like China. But they're growing very fast. The component cost is less than $50. So that means you're going to sell between $50 and $100 for a tablet, and $50 is sort of the number I have in mind pretty soon. So this is how the internet is going to spread to these countries. And if you look, compared to the technology behind 4G, it's generally thought that in about 2 or 3 years we'll have 20 meg on 4G, which is more than fast enough for movies and all. So then it just becomes a question of spectrum and the capacity. But in most of these countries, they don't have the Defense Department gobbling up the spectrum like we do in the U.S., for reasons I've never quite understood. And so they have a lot of spectrum that could be used. So this is what I think is going to happen, is we're going to see smartphones spread to these countries who already have high mobile penetration. And then that's how the internet's going to get to these places. And with the internet, you get all sorts of other good things like medical care and all, that have been talked about a lot. But you'll have the type of speeds you need, and it'll be all provided by the mobile companies. And then the smartphones and the tablets and all will be mainly produced by Chinese companies, using Western technology. So I'll end with this, which I find very interesting. In 1988, I did some consulting for Kodak, okay? And it's interesting to know that Kodak is no more, okay? So I once was heard to say to the Kodak executives, you know, the problem with you as a company is that whenever you look at any new project, you always say, but the profit margins aren't as high as they are in film. I mean, Kodak was an amazing engineering company, hired a lot of MIT chemical engineers, but they could produce X-ray film and regular film at as high a quality or higher quality than AGFA or the Japanese at about a third lower cost, or even a third lower cost than DuPont, because they really had it figured out. So I said to them, the problem with you for any new project, you know, this stuff is so profitable, unless you guys go into the business of selling crack, which you probably don't want to do, you're just never going to get profit margins like that again. The CEO laughed. But there was an element of truth to that. But the day in 2007 when the iPhone came out, you know, which was the first, arguably first, cell phone that had a computer hooked up to a cell phone, I went to lunch at MIT, and one of my colleagues was on the board of Nokia, which at the time was the largest selling cell phone company in the world, a Finnish company, which also is no more. I mean, in terms of cell phones, they're just about to vote to sell to Microsoft. But anyway, I said to him, I don't know whether you know it, but the iPhone came out today, and here's an iPhone. I bought one the day it came out, and the world has just changed. And you at Nokia had better realize that the world has changed, or you're not going to exist. I always use 10 years. I once said that about AT&T, that they wouldn't exist in 10 years' time. That was the old AT&T company that calls itself AT&T. I was wrong by 6 days. So that was a lucky guess. I mean, econometricians get lucky every once in a while. But anyway, I said to my colleague that Nokia is not going to exist in 10 years if you guys don't, you know, realize what just happened. And Nokia doesn't exist, and BlackBerry, you know, which had a lock on corporate cell phones, are not going to exist pretty soon either. So it's really interesting in, you know, with these technologies, how fast things change. I mean, Kodak had been around, you know, for 100 years. And it was, you know, it was an extraordinarily profitable company, part of the Dow index and all, and it's gone. And Nokia and BlackBerry are as good as gone. And I think Motorola, which is also an MIT, you know, engineer company, it's gone too. So I'd be amazed if they recovered. Okay, so, you know, the technology leaders were, Motorola really did the engineering. You know, they came out with the first cell phones. Nokia turned it into a consumer item. That was very successful. BlackBerry, you know, really did the email, and that was very successful. And by 2017, I doubt that any of them will exist. Okay? Unless the federal government decides to bail them out. Okay, so with that, I'll end and be glad to take any questions.
Gentleman over here on the left, and please identify yourself.
Hello, Jess Wilhelm, formerly from the Peace Corps, and I had a few comments for you. One, you mentioned Botswana there. The South African market is riddled with non-competitive agreements between the clients, and it makes cell phone costs very high in the whole Southern African region. So that's one reason you might be seeing lower value. Another thing that you brought up and only began to touch on is how do we take mobile phone services into GDP accounting in the first place. One of the things that brought me here was that 3 years ago, I think Ghana revised its GDP estimates upward significantly, largely on the basis of telecommunications. They didn't realize how they were accounting for telecommunication services was not taking in a broad enough picture. And when they made the revisions, GDP was no longer a low-income country. It moved into the lower middle-income countries virtually overnight because of how they had adjusted for 5 years of cell phones and other communications. If you could comment on that a little bit, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, most countries, including the U.S., do this in a very strange way. And I've written about this before, but the way that I think about it is, it's sort of this consumer surplus idea, and it's what's called virtual income, or virtual price that I've talked about in my academic work over the years. But it's the value that people place on this. So, I can't speak about individual countries. I don't know enough about them. But I'll give you an example in the U.S. So trade people in the U.S. say that when they look at trade, that it's had very little effect on U.S. consumers. Okay, but if you actually take cell phones in the U.S. and you not only look at the cell phones, but you look at the cell phone service, which people buy, which if by Verizon or AT&T is another $700 a year, then all at once it has a very large effect. So I don't quite know what the right answer is, but I think you need to take into account both the price of the phones and the service that people buy with the phones, which is what I try to do. And what people often do in the trade statistics is they only look at the price of the phones, and I don't know what they do in GDP. I think it varies across countries. But you put your finger on something. I wouldn't say, whether somebody is in the low income or low middle income, matters a lot, except maybe, from the point of view of the aid agencies or aid. But this is a point that I was trying to make before, that it varies by country, but a lot of countries, just don't get both the equipment and the service and take that into account. So, in my view, it needs to be done, but often isn't. Oh, well, I better let Harold be in charge.
Lady here. And please use the microphone and identify.
I wanted to know what your thoughts on Bangladesh were, because their income is still so low, and yet they were one of the first countries. I mean, Grameen Phone was one of the leading people,
right,
groups putting in cell phone things. And if cell phones or mobile phones actually do increase productivity in a country, what happened to Bangladesh?
Well, I think Bangladesh, and I'm speaking from memory, so this could be wrong, but they essentially don't have a fixed line phone service outside, the big cities. And so people find the ability to communicate valuable. And so even though it's a poor country, now I say in the paper, and you should understand this, that some of the cell phones are used for business purposes. I mean, and all I have is the overall statistics. But nevertheless, a lot of businesses in these countries are also very small, so exactly where the dividing line is between individual usage and business usage is not clear. But no, I think Bangladesh is, very much like India, although it's even poorer in that respect. And people found this very valuable because they were just completely cut off for the world. So, you can remember articles 10 years ago, in India at least, about the mobile phone woman. So there'd be one person in this village, and she'd buy a mobile phone, and she would come in and sell time to the people in the villages. And they found that to be valuable. I mean, that's why they were paying for it, of course. But there was only one mobile phone in the whole village. Now you go to these villages, and half the people have mobile phones. So that's the change. All I can say as an economist is presumably people are finding this valuable. They wouldn't spend their hard-earned money. And in Bangladesh, it's extremely hard-earned money. So that's what I find interesting about this, that, the private sector has come in and done what seemingly the public sector was unable to do, which is to provide communications and banking when it's allowed, in these rural areas, which otherwise would have neither.
Gentleman here.
You pointed out that India is not homogeneous. The different states have normalized in different ways. Have you looked at, the states are not by themselves homogeneous either. Have you looked at what the distribution by like income deciles or quartiles for the states? And related to that on heterogeneity, you show up as a character in another MIT student's recent book. Charles Mansky has you as the bogeyman for people who like parameters or indexes without variances. One point you say nice things about point estimates versus ranges, and I was wondering whether in presenting this kind of material you'd like to say something about the value of point estimates versus ranges.
Yeah, I think there might be a slight confusion, but in terms of the states, we do it so that each one has a fixed effect. So this is panel of data. So, each country has its own mean. So that does allow for heterogeneity. That's what's normally taken into account. And we do that for India as well. So we're identifying it off the variation over time. But I think the confusion with Chuck, who I quite like, it's not that all my parameters have standard errors or t-statistics. So that tells you how precisely they're estimated. What Chuck likes to do is to go and not put on as many assumptions, and then he doesn't get a point estimate, he gets a range. But that range doesn't tell you how likely a parameter estimate is. All it says is it can be anywhere in that range. I find that less useful. And so I've said that, in my view, you need to put more economics into the problem, and you'll get tighter ranges. And there's a paper on my website from about a month ago on estimating consumer surplus, where we allow for complete heterogeneity, vector heterogeneity, and we get a range, but it's a very narrow range. So I've just always believed that you want to put more economics into the problem than Chuck Mansky does, but I would say that's a difference in taste.
Final question, gentlemen here.
Have such a wide bunch of ideas here, all of which are interesting, but the one I would like to pursue is way back at the beginning about using mobile phones as a device for assessing, as an index, if you will, but as assessing welfare. The question was asked before, you are stepping into what is a buzzsaw discussion in India about the question of whether the poor are getting better or not as the result of the general economic development, because there are a set of articles that argue precisely that PPP doesn't work, etc., that what we have to look at are the components of consumption as reported, which, for example, do report declining consumption of food nutrients, etc., at the same time that they are increasing expenditures on communication, financial services, and transport. So maybe the answer is, if that's what people's, particularly poor people's, people getting between, well, mostly 1,800 to 2,200, 2,400 calories a day of consumption prefer to do, maybe that's what they should do. But I wondered if you could comment on that issue, because your paper is going to be at the center of the center of the firefight that's going to occur.
Well, no, I just see this as one component. So, as I said earlier, you should look at consumption, because at the end of the day, that's what you want to look at. Now, I think that, and I'm not an expert on development in India, but it's my understanding that there's a lot of food aid in India, but it's stolen by the people who do it. So in terms of the government statistics on food consumption, how good they are, I don't know. But I would say that what you want to do is you want to combine, this is what I said at the beginning, you would want to combine food consumption, refrigerators, washing machines, bicycles, cars, and cellular phones. And it seems to me that's the right way to do it, not focusing on PPP. So if I have a contribution to that battle and people say, we should look at actual consumption, I'll have done my duty. I say very carefully in the paper, it should not all be based on cellular, but it should be based on consumption, not on PPP. So that's my firmly held view. To the extent that actual food consumption is going down in India, caloric intake, all I can say is that should be looked into. If people are spending money on cell phones and reducing their caloric intake, if it's dangerous levels, then I don't quite understand it. So I'd want to look at it more deeply.
With that, please join me in thanking Professor Hausman.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah. Hi.